The desperate sobs of a woman echoed through the dusty streets of Georgetown, Colorado, on a blistering July afternoon in 1878, drawing curious yet unsympathetic glances from townsfolk who quickly turned their backs and continued about their business. Nora James clutched her swollen belly with one hand while the other gripped a worn leather satchel, her knuckles white with strain. At 22, she hadn't imagined she would be a widow, 6 months pregnant, and without a roof over her head. The sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat trickled down her neck, darkening the collar of her once fine dress that now hung loose everywhere except around her middle. "Please," she called out to a passing woman in a fine bonnet. "I need somewhere to stay. Just until I can." The woman quickened her pace, lifting her skirts to avoid the dust Nora's worn boots had disturbed. "We don't need your kind here," she muttered, just loudly enough to be heard. Nora had been traveling for weeks since her husband Thomas's death. The small mining claim they'd staked in the mountains had finally yielded a promising vein, but Thomas's celebration at the local saloon had ended with a dispute over cards. A single bullet had destroyed all their dreams, leaving Nora alone with their unborn child and a paper deed that meant nothing without a man to work the claim. Georgetown had been her last hope. The bustling silver mining town was supposed to be civilized, with proper establishments and decent folk. She'd spent her last coins on the stagecoach ride, believing she could find work as a seamstress or perhaps even a schoolteacher, having once taught children back in Pennsylvania before she'd married. "The boarding house is full," the pinch-faced proprietress had stated flatly when Nora inquired about a room, though Nora had clearly seen the vacancy sign. "The hotel doesn't accommodate women in your condition," the clerk had informed her with a disdainful glance at her ringless finger. Her wedding band had been sold 2 towns back for food. Even the church had turned her away. "We cannot encourage moral failing," the minister had said, his eyes never meeting hers as he shut the door. By late afternoon, Nora had tried every establishment in town. She sank onto a bench outside the general store, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The baby kicked vigorously, as if protesting their situation, and she placed a gentle hand over the spot. "It's all right, little one," she whispered. "We'll figure something out." The truth was, she had nowhere to go as night approached. Her thoughts turned darker as she considered her options. Perhaps she could find shelter in an abandoned mine shaft or barn, though such places harbored their own dangers. "Miss, you look like you could use some water." Nora looked up, squinting against the setting sun to see a tall figure standing before her. He held out a tin cup filled with clear water, his face shadowed by the brim of his worn cowboy hat. "Thank you," she murmured, accepting the cup with shaking hands. The water was cool and fresh, likely drawn from the well behind the store. She drank deeply before handing the cup back. "Much obliged," she said, trying to summon the strength to stand. She needed to find shelter before darkness fell completely. The man tilted his head slightly. "You're new to Georgetown." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Nora admitted, "though I don't think I'll be staying long." The cowboy shifted his weight, and as he moved, the fading sunlight illuminated his features. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 28 or 30, with sun-weathered skin, a strong jaw darkened by stubble, and kind eyes the color of faded denim. Not handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something steady about him that made Nora feel slightly less desperate. "I couldn't help overhearing some of your conversations today," he said, his voice low and even. "Folks here can be mighty particular about who they help." Nora felt a flush of shame rise to her cheeks. "I'm a widow, sir, not that it seems to matter much to anyone here." The cowboy nodded slowly. "Name's Royce Lawson. I work a small ranch just outside of town." "Nora James," she replied, struggling to rise from the bench. The baby had shifted, pressing against her spine, and she winced. "Mrs. James, I don't mean to presume, but it looks like you need a safe place for the night." He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of sun-bleached wheat. "I have a cabin. It's nothing fancy, but there's a spare room where you could stay until you sort things out." Nora stiffened. Alone as she was, she knew better than to accept such offers from strange men. "That's very kind, Mr. Lawson, but I couldn't. It's not just me there," he added quickly, understanding her hesitation. Mrs. Whittaker comes by daily to help with cooking and keeping things tidy. She's a widow herself, about 60 years old, mean as a rattlesnake but honest as they come. You'd be safe, madam, I give you my word. Nora studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. She'd grown skilled at reading men's intentions during her difficult journey west with Thomas, and then in the weeks since his death. All she saw in Royce Lawson's eyes was genuine concern. "Why would you help me when no one else will?" she asked plainly. Royce put his hat back on and glanced around at the town, his expression hardening slightly. "Because someone should. And if they won't, then I'll be the one who helps." He said it simply, as if it were the most natural conclusion in the world. A moment of silence stretched between them. The street was emptying as people headed home for supper or to the saloon for evening entertainment. Soon she would be truly alone. "I accept your offer, Mr. Lawson," Nora finally said. "And I thank you for it," Royce nodded. "My wagon's just down the street. Can you walk a bit more?" "I've been walking for weeks, Mr. Lawson. A few more yards won't defeat me." A small smile tugged at his lips. "No, madam, I don't reckon much would." The ride to Royce's ranch was quiet, the rhythmic creaking of the wagon wheels and the occasional snort from the horses the only sounds breaking the evening stillness. Nora clutched her satchel on her lap, occasionally stealing glances at the profile of the man who had offered her sanctuary. As they cleared the edge of town, the land opened up, revealing rolling foothills that eventually gave way to the majestic Rocky Mountains. The setting sun painted the landscape in rich golds and purples, the beauty momentarily distracting Nora from her troubles. "It's not much farther," Royce said, breaking the silence. "Just beyond that stand of cottonwoods." True to his word, they soon approached a modest but well-maintained cabin nestled against a backdrop of pines. A small barn stood nearby, and a corral housed several horses that lifted their heads curiously as the wagon approached. The property was simple but orderly, showing the care of a man who took pride in his work. "You live here alone?" Nora asked as he helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. "Just me and a couple of ranch hands who have their own quarters by the barn," he confirmed. "Been here 5 years now. Started with hardly anything, but the land's been good to me." Inside, the cabin was surprisingly comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A solid wooden table with 4 chairs occupied the center of the main room, and a few pieces of sturdy furniture were arranged thoughtfully. The floors were swept clean, and the windows, though small, had actual glass panes rather than the oiled paper Nora had seen in many frontier homes. "Your room would be through there," Royce said, gesturing to a door on the far side of the main room. "It's small, but there's a real bed with a decent mattress." Nora followed him to the room, which indeed contained a narrow bed covered with a colorful quilt, a small dresser, and a washstand with a pitcher and bowl. A window overlooked a small kitchen garden, now bathed in the last light of day. "This was meant to be a child's room someday," Royce explained, his voice taking on a slightly different quality. "Never got around to having any of those." "It's perfect," Nora said sincerely. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks. There's stew keeping warm on the stove. You should eat before you rest." The food was simple but delicious, a hearty venison stew with potatoes and carrots, accompanied by cornbread that was surprisingly light. Nora hadn't realized how hungry she was until she took the first bite, and she had to remind herself to eat slowly. "Mrs. Whittaker made the bread this morning," Royce said, watching her with satisfaction as she ate. "She'll be by tomorrow. She might seem prickly at first, but she's got a good heart." "Unlike most of the people in town," Nora couldn't help but comment. Royce sighed. "Georgetown's changing." The silver rush brought wealth, and with it, folks who think they're too respectable to associate with anyone they consider beneath them. But there are still good people here. He paused. "If you don't mind my asking, what brought you to these parts?" Nora set down her spoon and briefly told him about Thomas, their mining claim, and the cruel twist of fate that had left her alone. She didn't mention that they had eloped against her family's wishes, or that her parents had disowned her when she chose to follow Thomas west. Some pains were still too raw to share. "I'm sorry for your loss," Royce said when she finished. "A mining claim, you say?" Yes, in the mountains about 2 days' ride from here. Thomas was convinced it would make our fortune, but she shrugged helplessly. Even if it's valuable, I can't work it myself. Maybe not, but you could sell it or find a partner to work it for a percentage, Royce suggested. Mining claims can be worth something, even undeveloped ones if they're in the right location. I hadn't considered that, Nora admitted. A small flame of hope flickered in her chest for the first time in weeks. Do you know someone who might be interested? I might. There's a fellow named Ellis who comes into town every few weeks. He's an assayer with connections to several mining operations. Honest man, from what I can tell. He could at least tell you what the claim might be worth. Nora nodded thoughtfully. That would be helpful, thank you. After supper, fatigue hit her like a physical blow. Royce showed her where everything was, including a small bookshelf with a surprising variety of volumes. Feel free to borrow any of these, he offered, and there's fresh water in the pitcher. If you need anything in the night, just call out. I'll be in the main room. You're not taking your own bed, Nora asked, alarmed. The chair by the fire suits me fine. Been sleeping in worse places most of my life. Before she could protest further, he wished her good night and closed the door, leaving Nora alone with her thoughts. She changed into her nightdress, washed her face and hands in the cool water, and sank onto the bed with a sigh of relief. The mattress was stuffed with clean straw and surprisingly comfortable. As she drifted toward sleep, she found herself wondering about the quiet cowboy who had shown her more kindness in a few hours than she had experienced since Thomas's death. There was a story there, she was certain, behind those steady blue eyes and capable hands. Perhaps tomorrow she would learn more about the man who had taken in a pregnant widow when everyone else had turned away. Morning arrived with golden shafts of sunlight streaming through the small window and the aroma of coffee and frying bacon. Nora dressed quickly, smoothing her hair into a simple bun and splashing water on her face to refresh herself. She had slept better than she had in weeks, the security of solid walls and a locked door allowing her to truly rest. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Royce at the stove, turning bacon in a cast iron skillet. He glanced up at her entrance, a smile warming his features. "Good morning, Mrs. James. Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in a long time," she admitted. "And please call me Nora. After your kindness, formality seems unnecessary." "Nora, then," he agreed, sliding the bacon onto a plate where eggs were already waiting. "And I'm Royce to my friends." "Are we friends already?" she asked with a small smile, accepting the plate he offered. "I reckon anyone who's under my roof has at least the makings of friendship," he replied, pouring her a cup of coffee. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Royce spoke again. "I need to ride out and check on some cattle today. Mrs. Whittaker should be here within the hour. She'll get you settled proper." "I don't want to impose on her work routine," Nora said quickly. "I can help with chores. I'm perfectly capable." Royce regarded her thoughtfully. "I believe you are, but in your condition. Well, I wouldn't want to be responsible if anything happened." "I'm pregnant, not invalid," Nora replied firmly. "I've been taking care of myself since Thomas died, and I was working our claim alongside him before that. I know my limits." A look of respect crossed Royce's face. "Fair enough. Mrs. Whittaker will still appreciate the help, I'm sure. She complains that this place is too big for one woman to manage, though I suspect that's her way of telling me I ought to find a wife." The mention of a wife caused Nora to wonder again about Royce's past. "You've never married?" she asked before she could stop herself. "No," he answered simply, rising to take his plate to the wash basin. "Never found the right woman at the right time, I suppose." Before Nora could respond, a sharp knock at the door announced Mrs. Whittaker's arrival. The older woman bustled in without waiting for an invitation, her arms full of fresh linens. She stopped short at the sight of Nora, her eyebrows rising toward her gray hairline. "So the gossip's true," she said bluntly. "You've taken in a stray Royce Lawson." "Mrs. Whittaker, this is Mrs. James," Royce said evenly. "She'll be staying with us for a while." The older woman's keen eyes took in Nora's condition, the simple wedding ring Royce had lent her to wear in town, to prevent further gossip, he'd explained, and the way she sat straight-backed at the table despite her obvious fatigue. "HMPH," Mrs. Whittaker finally said. Well, at least you're not one of those painted women from the saloon. I told him last time that if he brought home another one of those, I'd quit on the spot. Mrs. Whittaker, Royce warned, a flush rising on his neck. Nora bit back a smile. I assure you, Mrs. Whittaker, I'm not from the saloon. I'm a widow in need of temporary lodging, nothing more. The older woman's expression softened slightly. Well, that's something at least. You can help me with the washing today. Sitting too much isn't good for a woman in your condition. With that declaration, Mrs. Whittaker set about her tasks, occasionally barking orders at Nora, but otherwise accepting her presence with remarkable ease. Royce departed shortly after, tipping his hat to Nora with a small smile that suggested he knew exactly what she'd be facing with Mrs. Whittaker. The day passed in a blur of domestic activity. Despite her initial gruffness, Mrs. Whittaker proved to be an excellent teacher, showing Nora the routines of the household and sharing bits of local knowledge. By the time she departed in the late afternoon, Nora felt she had made an ally, if not exactly a friend. Left alone, Nora took the opportunity to explore the cabin more thoroughly. The bookshelves revealed an unexpected side to her host: volumes of poetry, several history books, and even a few novels suggested a mind that sought more than just the practical knowledge needed for ranching. On a small table near Royce's bedroll by the fireplace, she noticed a framed tintype photograph. Curiosity overcame her hesitation, and she picked it up carefully. It showed a young Royce, perhaps 18 or 19, standing beside a woman who shared his eyes and the curve of his jaw. His mother, she assumed. Both were dressed formally, with serious expressions common in such photographs, yet there was something in the way the woman's hand rested on Royce's shoulder that spoke of deep affection. That's the only picture I have of her. Nora startled at Royce's voice, nearly dropping the frame. She hadn't heard him enter. I'm sorry, she said quickly, setting the photograph back carefully. I shouldn't have pried. It's all right, he said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. My mother died the year after that was taken. Pneumonia took her quickly. I'm sorry for your loss, Nora said softly. She was beautiful. She was kind, Royce replied, his voice holding a note of reverence. Taught me that a person's worth isn't in what they own or where they come from, but in how they treat others when there's nothing to be gained. He moved to the wash basin, rolling up his sleeves to wash the dust from his hands and face. That's why I couldn't just ride past when I saw you on that bench yesterday. The simple honesty of his statement touched something deep within Nora. She would be proud of the man you've become, she said. Royce glanced at her, water dripping from his face. For a moment, vulnerability showed in his eyes before he nodded once and reached for a towel. That evening established a pattern that would continue in the days that followed. They would share meals and conversation, each gradually revealing more of themselves. Nora learned that Royce had come west after his mother's death, working as a cowhand on various ranches before saving enough to stake his own small claim. He'd built the cabin himself, adding to it over the years as his herd grew and his circumstances improved. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, her brief career as a teacher, and her whirlwind courtship with Thomas, a charismatic dreamer who had promised her adventure and a fresh start in the West. Did you find it? Royce asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in fiery hues. The adventure he promised? Nora considered the question, one hand resting on her belly where the baby kicked rhythmically. Yes and no, she finally answered. The journey west was certainly an adventure, though not always in pleasant ways, and I saw places and things I never would have experienced in Pennsylvania. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But the life we actually lived once we arrived, that was more hardship than adventure. Thomas was always chasing the next opportunity, convinced that prosperity was just around the corner. And you? Royce asked quietly. What were you chasing? The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked what she had wanted from the journey west. A home, she admitted after a moment. Somewhere to belong, to put down roots. Thomas always talked about going back east once we'd made our fortune, but she shook her head. I fell in love with the mountains, the sky, the wildness of it all. I wanted to stay. Royce nodded, understanding in his eyes. The West gets into your blood that way. Makes it hard to imagine living anywhere else. A week passed and then two. Nora's presence at the ranch gradually became less remarkable. Mrs. Whittaker had fully accepted her, even bringing extra fabric so Nora could sew clothes for the baby. The ranch hands tipped their hats respectfully when they saw her, and Royce. Royce seemed to brighten whenever she entered a room. For her part, Nora found herself looking forward to his return each evening, watching the way his hands moved as he repaired tack or whittled small wooden figures, listening to the low cadence of his voice as he recounted the day's events. She told herself it was merely gratitude and the natural camaraderie of shared living, but in quiet moments, she admitted it was more. On a crisp morning in early August, Royce announced that Ellis, the assayer he had mentioned, would be passing through Georgetown the following day. "If you'd like, we could ride into town and have him look at your claim documents," he offered. "Might give you a better idea of your options." Nora agreed eagerly. The prospect of possibly selling the claim represented financial independence, a way to ensure her child's future without being entirely dependent on Royce's generosity. Though she had grown comfortable at the ranch, she knew she couldn't stay indefinitely. The thought of leaving brought an unexpected ache to her heart. The trip to town was uneventful, though Nora noticed the curious stares and whispered comments that followed them as they made their way to the assayer's office. Georgetown's residents had clearly noted her residence at the Lawson Ranch, and speculation ran rampant. Royce ignored the attention with practiced ease, keeping a protective hand at her elbow as they navigated the busy street. Ellis proved to be a sharp-eyed man in his 50s with a meticulous manner that inspired confidence. He examined the deed and Thomas's rough maps with professional interest. "This is in a promising area," he said finally, looking up from the documents. "There's been significant silver found in those ridges. Your husband's initial samples show potential." "What would such a claim be worth?" Nora asked, trying to keep the hope from her voice. Ellis considered. "Undeveloped as it is, with just preliminary work done. Perhaps $800 to $1,000 to the right buyer. Worked properly, it could be worth considerably more." The sum was substantial enough to provide for her and the baby for quite some time, or to invest in a small business or property. "I know of several investors who might be interested," Ellis continued. "I could make inquiries if you'd like." "Yes, please," Nora said, relief washing over her. "I would appreciate that very much." As they left the office, Royce suggested lunch at the hotel restaurant, a piece offering to her stomach after the jostling wagon ride. The same clerk who had turned her away weeks before now ushered them to a table with fawning courtesy, his eyes darting nervously to Royce's imposing figure. "It seems your company improves my social standing," Nora remarked dryly once they were seated. Royce's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Amazing how money and a little influence change people's perception of propriety. Does it bother you?" she asked. "The way they treat you differently because of your success. It reminds me who my real friends are," he replied. "The ones who were decent to me when I had nothing but a horse and the clothes on my back." After lunch, they stopped at the general store for supplies. As Royce conducted business with the shopkeeper, Nora browsed the shelves, admiring small luxuries she hadn't been able to afford in months. Nora James, is that really you?" The voice, familiar and unexpected, froze her in place. Slowly, she turned to face a tall, elegantly dressed woman with copper-colored hair and green eyes that Nora would have recognized anywhere. "Rebecca," she breathed. "What are you doing in Georgetown?" Rebecca Martin had been Nora's closest friend in Pennsylvania, the daughter of the town's bank manager and someone Nora had never expected to see again after her hasty departure with Thomas. "My husband is involved in banking interests here," Rebecca explained, her eyes wide as they took in Nora's condition. "But everyone thought you had gone to California with that miner." "Thomas," Nora supplied. "We came to Colorado instead. Her voice caught. He died 3 months ago." Rebecca's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "Oh, Nora, I'm so sorry." She glanced at Nora's advanced pregnancy. "And the baby, due in about 2 months," Nora said, one hand instinctively moving to her belly. "Are you staying in town? You must come to dinner." Henry would be delighted to see you, and is everything all right, Nora? Royce's quiet voice interrupted as he approached, carrying parcels under one arm. Yes, Nora assured him, suddenly aware of how the situation might appear. Rebecca, this is Royce Lawson. Royce, this is Rebecca Martin, an old friend from Pennsylvania. Rebecca's eyebrows rose slightly as she assessed Royce, taking in his simple but well-made clothes and confident bearing. A pleasure, Mr. Lawson, she said politely, though confusion was evident in her expression. Likewise, Mrs. Martin, Royce replied with a respectful nod. Nora, we should probably head back before the weather turns. Those clouds look threatening. Of course, Nora agreed, noticing for the first time the darkening sky visible through the store windows. She turned back to Rebecca. It was wonderful to see you, perhaps another time. Yes, Rebecca said quickly, pressing a calling card into Nora's hand. This is our address. Please come visit when you can. There's so much to catch up on. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the journey into town had been. Royce seemed lost in thought, and Nora found herself mulling over the unexpected encounter with Rebecca. Seeing her friend had stirred memories of her life before Thomas, a life of relative comfort and clear social expectations. It felt like it belonged to another person entirely. Your friend seemed surprised to see you, Royce finally commented as they neared the ranch. We lost touch after I left with Thomas, Nora explained. My parents, they didn't approve of him or our marriage. They disowned me when I chose to follow him west. Royce absorbed this information silently, his hands steady on the reins. Do you regret it? He asked after a moment. Leaving that life behind, Nora considered the question carefully. I regret the rift with my family, she said honestly, but not the choice to forge my own path. If I hadn't left, I wouldn't have seen the West, wouldn't have experienced true independence. She paused, then added softly, and I wouldn't have met you. The words hung in the air between them, more revealing than she had intended. Royce's hands tightened momentarily on the reins before he relaxed them again. I'm glad you did, he said simply. Meet me, that is. That evening, a summer thunderstorm rolled through the valley, bringing with it sheets of rain that drummed against the cabin roof. After supper, Royce built up the fire against the sudden chill, and they sat together in its warm glow, the comfortable silence occasionally broken by conversation. Ellis seemed optimistic about your claim, Royce remarked, whittling what appeared to be a small wooden horse. A collection of similar figures already lined the mantel, awaiting the child who would play with them. Yes, Nora agreed. It's more than I hoped for. With that money, I could start fresh somewhere, perhaps open a small shop or boarding house. The prospect should have filled her with excitement, but instead she felt a strange reluctance at the thought of leaving. Royce's hands stilled. You've been thinking about where you'll go after the baby comes. It wasn't a question, but Nora answered anyway. I need to plan for our future. I can't impose on your generosity forever. It's not an imposition. Royce set aside his carving and faced her directly. Nora, these past weeks, having you here has changed things, changed me. Her heart quickened at the intensity in his voice. Royce. Let me say this, he continued, his words measured as if he'd rehearsed them. I know it hasn't been long since you lost your husband. I know you're still grieving and you've got this little one to think about. He gestured toward her belly. But I want you to know that you have a place here if you want it, not just as a guest or a friend, but... He hesitated, then pushed on. I care for you, Nora, more than I thought possible in such a short time. Nora felt tears prick at her eyes, emotion welling up so strongly she couldn't immediately speak. The feelings she had been trying to ignore, to attribute to gratitude or circumstance, suddenly demanded acknowledgement. I care for you too, she whispered, but it's complicated. The baby, Thomas's memory, what people would say. I'm not asking for promises right now, Royce assured her. Just asking you to consider staying, giving us time to see what this might become, and as for the baby, his expression softened. I'd be honored to help raise any child of yours, Nora, to give them my name if that's what you both wanted someday. A powerful contraction suddenly gripped Nora, stealing her breath and cutting off her response. She gasped, clutching her belly as pain radiated through her lower back. Nora. Royce was immediately at her side, concern etched across his features. What is it? The baby, she managed through clenched teeth. But it's too early, still over a month until another contraction hit, and she cried out softly. Royce's expression changed from concern to determination. "I'll fetch Mrs. Whittaker. She knows more about these things than I do." He helped her to her bedroom, his movements gentle but efficient. "Will you be all right for a few minutes while I ride to her place?" Nora nodded, trying to breathe through the fading contraction. "Yes, but hurry. I think this baby has plans of its own." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and effort. Royce returned with Mrs. Whittaker, who took charge with brisk efficiency, sending him outside to pace the porch while she attended to Nora. The storm continued to rage, punctuating Nora's labor with crashes of thunder that seemed to echo her pain. Near midnight, just as the storm began to abate, the cries of a newborn filled the small cabin. Mrs. Whittaker cleaned the infant, wrapped him in a soft blanket, and placed him in Nora's arms. "A strong boy," she announced with uncharacteristic gentleness. "Small but healthy by the look of him." Nora gazed down at her son, overcome with love for the tiny person she had carried for so long. He had Thomas's dark hair and her own rounded chin, his tiny fists curled tightly as if ready to take on the world. "Can Royce come in now?" she asked, surprising herself with the request. But it felt right he should be among the first to meet this new life, Mrs. Whittaker nodded approvingly and went to the door. A moment later, Royce entered, his face a mixture of wonder and uncertainty as he approached the bed. "You have a son," Nora told him, tilting the bundle slightly so he could see. "He's perfect," Royce said softly, a smile spreading across his face. "Just like his mother. I want to name him William after my father," Nora said. "William Thomas James." She paused, then added quietly, "For now, at least." Royce's eyes met hers, understanding the subtle message in her words. "It's a fine name," he agreed. "One that would serve him well his whole life, whatever the future brings." Mrs. Whittaker bustled about, cleaning up and preparing a light broth for Nora, but Royce remained by the bedside, his presence a comfort as Nora drifted between wakefulness and exhausted sleep. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. Nora awoke to find Royce dozing in a chair beside her bed, his hand resting near hers on the coverlet. Baby William slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle Royce had constructed weeks earlier, lined with the softest blankets Mrs. Whittaker could find. As if sensing her gaze, Royce stirred and opened his eyes. "Good morning," he said quietly, his voice rough with sleep. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," Nora admitted, "but happy, relieved." He nodded, understanding what she didn't say, the fear that had accompanied her throughout the pregnancy, the worry about bringing a child into an uncertain world alone. "About what you said last night," she began, gathering her courage. "Before the baby decided to make his entrance." "You don't have to answer now," Royce said quickly. "You've been through a lot and you need time to recover, to think." "I've had nothing but time to think these past months," Nora replied, "about what I want, what I need." She reached out and took his hand, his calluses rough against her softer skin. "I want to stay, Royce, not just because it's convenient or because I have nowhere else to go, but because being here with you feels right in a way nothing has since Thomas died, maybe even before that." The hope that bloomed on his face was beautiful to behold. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel obligated or rushed." "I'm sure that I want to try," she said honestly, "to see if what we feel can grow into something lasting. William and I both need time, but I think this could be home." "You could be home." Royce lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then we'll take all the time you need, day by day." 2 years later, on a crisp autumn day, Nora stood on the porch of the expanded cabin, watching as Royce lifted William onto the back of a gentle pony. The boy's delighted laughter carried across the yard, his little hands gripping the saddle horn while Royce led the pony in a slow circle. "Not too fast," Nora called, one hand resting protectively on the slight swell of her belly where their second child grew. "We're being careful, Mama," William assured her with all the seriousness a 2.5-year-old could muster. He had Thomas's dark coloring but Royce's steady nature, and he worshipped the man he now called Pa with unabashed adoration. Royce looked up at Nora, love evident in his eyes even from a distance. Their courtship had been unconventional, begun in crisis, developed through shared responsibility, and consummated in a quiet wedding ceremony 6 months after William's birth. But the bond between them had only strengthened with time, built on mutual respect, shared values, and a deep understanding of life's fragility and sweetness. Georgetown had gradually accepted their unusual family, particularly after Ellis's efforts had resulted in the sale of Nora's mining claim for an impressive $1,200. The money had been invested in expanding Royce's ranch and establishing a small trust for William's education. Nora had also used a portion to open a correspondence with her parents, sending them a photograph of their grandson with a letter explaining her new life. Their cautious response had eventually led to a reconciliation, though they had yet to visit in person. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Royce lifted William from the pony and carried him back to the house, the boy chattering excitedly about his adventure. Nora welcomed them with open arms, drawing them both into an embrace that felt like coming home. Later that evening, with William asleep in his room, no longer a makeshift nursery but a proper bedroom complete with a small desk for future lessons, Nora and Royce sat together on the porch swing Royce had built the previous summer. "Do you ever think about that day in town?" Nora asked, her head resting against his shoulder. "When everyone turned me away and you were the only one who offered help," Royce's arm tightened around her. "Sometimes. Mostly I think about how close I came to not being there at all. I almost didn't go to town that day." "But you did," Nora said softly, "and it changed everything." "For the better," he agreed, his hand coming to rest gently on her belly. "Much better." As twilight deepened into night, they remained together on the porch, the gentle creaking of the swing keeping time with their shared heartbeat. Above them, stars appeared one by one in the vast Colorado sky, silent witnesses to the family that had been forged not by blood or circumstance, but by a simple act of kindness when it was needed most.